The last thing Lucas Grayson expected as he stepped off the private jet in Santorini was the suffocating realization of freedom and the weight of what he'd left behind. The Mediterranean sunlight glinted off his aviators as he took in the dramatic cliffs and endless blue sea, but his heart was racing for an entirely different reason. Back in New York, his father was likely furious, his mother heartbroken, and the woman he was supposed to marry probably humiliated. But Lucas didn't care. He wasn't about to chain himself to a loveless, business-driven marriage just to appease his family's ambitions. Not when he had his own dreams, his own life to live, Mr. Grayson, your villa is ready, the driver said, pulling up in a sleek black car that screamed wealth. Lucas nodded, climbing into the plush leather seat. He'd chosen Santorini for its isolation, its beauty, and most importantly, its distance from the suffocating expectations of his billionaire family. Here, no one would recognize him as the heir to Grayson Enterprises. Here, he could be just a man, not a pawn in his father's corporate chess game. As the car wound its way up the cliffs, Lucas couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. His parents had spent months planning his engagement to the daughter of another powerful family, envisioning a merger that would expand their empire. But Lucas had never even met her before the engagement dinner. The thought of marrying a stranger for money made his stomach churn, and so, 2 days before the wedding, he'd vanished. The villa was breathtaking, a sprawling white structure perched on the edge of a cliff, with an infinity pool that seemed to spill into the Aegean Sea. Lucas barely glanced at it as he dropped his luggage in the foyer and headed straight for the terrace, where the air was salty and the horizon endless. For the first time in weeks, he exhaled. But freedom, as it turned out, was short-lived. The next morning, Lucas wandered into town, hoping to blend in with the tourists and locals. He kept it simple, just a plain t-shirt and jeans, sunglasses shielding his face. No one gave him a second glance, and for the first time in his life he felt invisible. It was exhilarating. And then he saw her. She was behind the counter of a small bookstore tucked into a cobblestone alley, her dark hair loosely tied back, a pencil tucked behind one ear. She wore a simple dress that fluttered in the breeze as she rearranged a stack of books, her soft hum barely audible over the chatter of tourists outside. Something about her was magnetic, completely unpolished and effortlessly real, a stark contrast to the women Lucas had grown up around, who wore designer labels like armor and spoke in calculated tones. He stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. The scent of old paper and lavender filled the air, and Lucas felt an odd sense of calm. "Can I help you?" she asked, glancing up. Her eyes were a striking shade of green, bright and curious, and they locked onto his with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "I was just browsing," he replied, suddenly feeling foolish. He wasn't a reader, not really, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. "Well, let me know if you need recommendations," she said with a small smile, turning back to her task. "What's your favorite?" he blurted out, desperate to keep her talking. She paused, studying him for a moment. "Favorite book?" "That's like asking me to name a favorite star in the sky." "Then name one," he challenged, his lips curving into a grin. She hesitated, then pulled a worn paperback from the shelf. "This one. The Alchemist. It's about chasing your destiny." Lucas took the book, his fingers brushing against hers for the briefest moment. "Sounds fitting." Her smile widened, and for a second, Lucas forgot why he'd come to Santorini in the first place. "I'm Isla, by the way," she said, extending her hand. "Lucas," he replied, shaking it. He almost added his last name out of habit, but stopped himself. Here, he wasn't Lucas Grayson, heir to a fortune. He was just Lucas. Over the next few days, Lucas found himself returning to the bookstore again and again, each time with a new excuse. He bought books he had no intention of reading, lingered longer than necessary, and even helped Isla rearrange displays when the shop was slow. He learned that she'd grown up on the island, that the bookstore had belonged to her late mother, and that she was fiercely independent, refusing to sell the shop despite offers from developers who wanted to turn the quaint alley into a luxury shopping district. "Why don't you sell?" Lucas asked one afternoon as they shared coffee on the shop's tiny balcony. Isla shrugged, her gaze fixed on the sea. "Because it's more than a shop, it's memories. It's home." Her words struck a chord in Lucas. He'd spent his whole life surrounded by luxury, yet he'd never had a place that felt like home. His family's Manhattan penthouse was pristine but cold, and their summer estates were nothing more than status symbols. Isla's world was small but full of meaning, and Lucas found himself drawn to it and to her in ways he couldn't explain, but he couldn't tell her the truth. Not yet. He couldn't risk shattering the fragile connection they were building. One evening, as they walked along the beach, Isla turned to him, her eyes searching. "Why are you really here, Lucas?" He hesitated, the weight of his secrets pressing down on him. "I needed to get away," he said finally, "from everything." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Well, whatever you're running from, I hope you find what you're looking for." Lucas didn't respond. How could he tell her that what he was starting to look for, what he was starting to want, was her? The waves crashed softly against the shore as Isla's words hung between them, unanswered. Lucas didn't know how to respond without unraveling the tightly wound secret he'd been carrying since the day he arrived in Santorini. So instead, he offered her a small, lingering smile, one that he hoped conveyed gratitude, even if it couldn't offer her clarity. Isla seemed to accept it, her gaze drifting back toward the horizon as though she could find the answers there. The days that followed were a blur of shared moments, each one drawing Lucas deeper into Isla's world. He found himself craving her company, the sound of her laugh, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about the things that mattered to her, her shop, the island, her dreams of someday traveling beyond the shores of Santorini. She was unlike anyone he'd ever met, so unpretentious and real, and he couldn't help but wonder what she saw in him. Did she see the man he was pretending to be, or could she sense the weight of the life he'd left behind? But the illusion of simplicity couldn't last forever. It was a balmy evening when Lucas found himself at a local taverna with Isla. She'd insisted on treating him to a traditional dinner, refusing to let him pay after he'd joked that he was terrible at cooking and owed her a proper meal to make up for it. The restaurant was small and cozy, with string lights draped across the outdoor patio and the scent of grilled seafood wafting through the air. A local musician strummed a bouzouki in the corner, his soulful melodies blending seamlessly with the laughter and chatter of the other diners. "You're surprisingly good at blending in," Isla teased as she poured them both a glass of ouzo. "If I didn't know any better, I'd think you've been living here your whole life." Lucas smirked, raising his glass to hers. "Maybe I'm just a quick learner. Or maybe you're hiding something," she said playfully, though there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes that made Lucas shift uncomfortably in his seat. "Everyone's hiding something," he countered, his tone lighter than he felt. Isla tilted her head, studying him. "Maybe. But I get the feeling your something is bigger than most." Before he could respond, the waiter arrived with their food, breaking the tension. Isla beamed as she explained each dish to him: grilled octopus, dolmades, spanakopita, as though she were sharing a piece of herself. Lucas listened intently, not so much because he cared about the food, but because he loved the way her voice softened when she talked about things she loved. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned to dreams and regrets. Isla admitted that while she loved the island, she sometimes felt trapped by it. "I've always wanted to see the world," she confessed, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "Paris, Tokyo, New York, but the shop, it's all I have left of my mother." Selling it would feel like losing her all over again. Lucas's chest tightened at her words. He wanted to tell her that New York wasn't as glamorous as she imagined, that it was cold and ruthless, and that people like her would be swallowed whole by its greed. But he didn't. Instead, he reached across the table and took her hand in his thumb brushing against her knuckles. "You'll get there," he said softly. "When the time is right, you'll find a way." Isla looked at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and something else, something that made Lucas's heart race. For a moment, it felt as though the rest of the world had faded away, leaving only the two of them in their little bubble of warmth and possibility. But the bubble burst the next morning. Lucas was on the terrace of his villa, sipping his coffee and staring out at the sea when his phone buzzed. He'd been ignoring calls for weeks, but this one caught his attention. It was from his assistant, Claire, and the sheer persistence of her attempts to reach him suggested it was something urgent. He answered grudgingly. "Claire, I told you they found you," she interrupted, her voice tense. "Your father's people. They know you're in Santorini." Lucas's grip on the phone tightened. "How? I don't know," she admitted. "But they're sending someone to bring you back. You need to be careful." Lucas hung up without responding, his mind racing. He'd known this day would come eventually, but he hadn't expected it to happen so soon. He glanced toward the town, his thoughts immediately drifting to Isla. How could he explain this to her? Should he even try? The last thing he wanted was to drag her into his mess, but the idea of leaving without saying goodbye felt unbearable. That evening, Lucas returned to the bookstore, hoping to find Isla alone. She was there, as always, her hair pulled back, and her lips curved into that soft, welcoming smile that never failed to disarm him. "You're quiet today," she observed as he lingered near the counter, pretending to browse. "Is everything okay?" Lucas hesitated, his chest tightening as he searched for the right words. "I need to talk to you," he said finally. Isla's smile faltered, concern flickering across her face. "What's wrong?" He glanced around the shop, ensuring they were alone before leaning in closer. "I haven't been entirely honest with you," her brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I'm not who you think I am," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Back home, my life is complicated." "My family is complicated." Isla's expression softened, but there was a trace of confusion in her eyes. "Lucas, everyone has a past. Whatever it is, it doesn't change who you are now." "You don't understand," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't come here just to escape. I came here because I had to. Because if I stayed, I'd be trapped in a life I didn't want." "Trapped how?" she asked, her voice gentle but insistent. Lucas hesitated, the weight of his secret pressing down on him. "My family arranged for me to marry someone, for business reasons. I didn't love her. I'd never even met her before the engagement." Isla's eyes widened, but she didn't interrupt. "I couldn't go through with it," he continued. "So I left, I ran, and now they're trying to bring me back." The silence that followed was deafening. Isla stared at him, her expression unreadable, and Lucas felt his chest tighten with every passing second. Finally, she spoke. "So, you're running from an arranged marriage." "Not just that," he said quickly. "I'm running from a life that isn't mine. A life where every choice is made for me." Isla nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the counter. "I guess I'm not the only one who feels trapped." Lucas reached for her hand, his touch tentative. "I didn't tell you this to push you away. I couldn't keep lying to you." Isla looked up, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you for telling me the truth." For a moment, Lucas felt a flicker of hope, but then she pulled her hand away, her expression guarded. "I need some time to think," she said softly. Lucas nodded, his heart sinking. "Take all the time you need." As he left the shop that evening, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just shattered something fragile and precious. He only hoped it wasn't beyond repair. Lucas paced the length of his villa, his mind spinning as he replayed Isla's parting words over and over. He had done the right thing, hadn't he? Telling her the truth was supposed to bring them closer, to eliminate the barrier that had been growing between them every time he looked into her trusting eyes. But now, with her needing time to think, Lucas felt like he was spiraling. And to make matters worse, Claire's warning about his father's people still loomed over him like a dark cloud. A knock at the door broke through his thoughts, startling him. His heart leapt, foolishly hoping it was Isla, but when he opened the door, it was the villa's concierge. Mr. Grayson, the man said with a polite nod, holding out a small envelope. This was left for you at the front desk. Lucas frowned, taking the envelope and thanking the man before shutting the door. He tore it open, his stomach tightening as he read the note inside. You can't run forever. It's time to come back where you belong. There was no signature, but Lucas didn't need one to know who had sent it. His father's reach was longer than he'd wanted to admit, and now it was clear the elder Grayson wasn't going to let him hide in peace. Lucas clenched the note in his fist, his jaw tightening. If his father thought he could intimidate him into compliance, he'd sorely underestimated how far Lucas was willing to go to live his own life. But this wasn't just about Lucas anymore. Isla's face flashed in his mind, her warm smile, the way she'd looked at him with something so close to trust. He couldn't let his father's shadow touch her, not when she'd already been through so much. He had to figure out a way to protect her without dragging her into his world. The answer came to him that evening, as he stood on the villa's terrace staring out at the sea. If he couldn't beat his father's influence from here, he'd have to confront it head-on. But first, there was one person he needed to see. The bookstore was closed when Lucas arrived, the lights off and the door locked. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the glass as he peered inside. The sight of the empty shop, usually so full of life with Isla's presence, hit him harder than he expected. He needed to see her, to explain everything and to tell her the one thing he'd been too afraid to say. Lucas. He turned at the sound of her voice, finding Isla standing a few feet away, a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. She looked surprised to see him, but not entirely unhappy. I was just heading home, she said, gesturing toward the alley behind her. What are you doing here? I needed to see you, Lucas said, stepping closer. I know you said you needed time, but I couldn't leave things like this. Not without telling you how I feel. Isla's expression softened, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. I didn't come to Santorini looking for anything other than escape, he admitted. I thought I could get away from my family, from the life they were forcing on me. But then I met you, and everything changed. You made me see what it's like to live a life that actually means something, a life that's full of purpose and love. Lucas, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, but he held up a hand to stop her. Let me finish, he said. I know I've complicated things by bringing my baggage into your life, and I hate that. But I need you to know this before anything else happens. I've fallen in love with you, Isla. I didn't expect it, and I certainly didn't plan for it, but it's the truth. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, Lucas thought he'd overstepped. But then she took a step closer, her bag slipping from her shoulder and landing on the ground between them. You love me, she asked, her voice trembling slightly. I do, he said without hesitation. And I want to be with you, Isla, but I need to make sure you're safe first. My father, he won't stop until he gets what he wants, and right now, that means dragging me back to New York. I can't let him use you as leverage. Lucas, I'm not afraid of your father, she said, her voice firm despite the tears welling in her eyes. But I am afraid of losing you. If you leave now, how do I know you'll come back? Because I can't imagine my life without you, he said, reaching out to cup her face in his hands. I'm going to fix this, Isla. I'll make sure my father understands that I'm not going back to the life he wants for me. But once I do, I want to come back here to you. Her gaze searched his, and whatever she saw there must have convinced her because she nodded. "Okay," she said softly, "but promise me one thing, anything." "Promise me you won't let him take away the man you've become here," she said. "The man I fell in love with." Lucas's breath hitched, his heart swelling at her words. "I promise," he said, leaning down to capture her lips in a kiss that was both fierce and tender. It was a promise sealed in the only way he knew how, with every ounce of love he felt for her. When they pulled apart, Isla rested her forehead against his. "Come back to me," she whispered. "I will," he vowed. "And when I do, I'll prove to you just how much you mean to me." Lucas's departure from Santorini was as quiet as his arrival had been. He left a note for Isla at the bookstore, promising again that he would return as soon as he could. The flight back to New York was tense, his mind racing with thoughts of how he would confront his father. But one thing kept him grounded: it wasn't just about standing up for himself anymore. It was about fighting for the life he wanted, the life he had glimpsed with Isla. The confrontation with his father was explosive, as Lucas had expected. The elder Grayson was livid at his son's defiance, accusing him of jeopardizing the family's reputation and business. But Lucas stood his ground, refusing to be bullied into submission. "This isn't just about me anymore," Lucas said firmly. "I've found someone who makes me want to be a better man, and I won't let you or anyone else take that away from me." His father scoffed, but Lucas didn't waver. He laid out his terms clearly. He would continue to support the family business, but only on his own terms. The arranged marriage was off the table, and any further attempts to control his life would result in him walking away entirely. It wasn't an easy battle, but Lucas had something his father couldn't fight against: conviction. And when the dust finally settled, Lucas knew he had won. 2 weeks later, Lucas stepped off a plane in Santorini, his heart pounding with anticipation. He didn't call ahead or warn Isla of his return. He wanted to surprise her. With a bouquet of sunflowers in hand, he made his way to the bookstore, hoping against hope that she would be there. When he pushed open the door, the bell jingled softly, and Isla looked up from behind the counter. Her eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "You came back," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told you I would," Lucas said, stepping closer, "and I brought these for you." He held out the flowers, his hands trembling slightly. Isla took them, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You're really here." "I'm here," he said, reaching for her hand. "And I'm not going anywhere ever again." This time, when he kissed her, it was with the certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. 2 months later, the sun shone brightly over Santorini, casting a golden glow over the whitewashed buildings and the endless blue of the Aegean Sea. The island hummed with life as tourists meandered through the cobblestone streets, their laughter and chatter blending with the soft strumming of a street musician's guitar. But for Isla, the world outside barely existed. She was in the bookstore, rearranging the display of new arrivals when the doorbell jingled. She glanced up, expecting the usual: a curious tourist or one of the locals stopping by for their weekly read. Instead, a deliveryman in a crisp white shirt and navy trousers stood holding an oversized box wrapped in white paper and tied with a navy ribbon. "Miss Isla Macris?" the man asked, consulting a clipboard. "That's me," Isla replied, stepping forward. "What's this?" "Delivery for you," he said with a polite smile, setting the box on the counter and handing her a small envelope along with it. Frowning, Isla accepted the envelope first and opened it. Inside was a handwritten note on thick, luxurious stationery. "For the woman who taught me to love, to dream, and to live again. I hope this reminds you that you've always deserved the world, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you have it. Yours, Lucas." Her heart skipped a beat, and her hands trembled slightly as she set the note down. She untied the ribbon and opened the box, gasping softly at what was inside. A stunning dress in a deep emerald green, its fabric shimmering as though it had been spun from sunlight and magic. Isla hesitated, running her fingers over the soft material before noticing another note tucked inside the box. "Wear this tonight. I'll be waiting for you at the Thalassa at 7. Isla's pulse quickened. The Thalassa was the most exclusive restaurant on the island, perched on a cliffside with breathtaking views of the sunset. She had never been not because she didn't want to, but because it was a place meant for fairy tales, for people with lives so far removed from hers that she didn't dare dream of stepping into their world. But Lucas had brought a piece of that world to her, and now she couldn't help but wonder what else he had planned. At precisely 7 o'clock, Isla stepped out of a taxi in front of the Thalassa. The emerald dress fit her perfectly, flowing elegantly around her as though it had been made just for her. Her hair was swept into a loose updo, and the silver earrings she wore simple but striking had belonged to her mother. She took a deep breath, nerves fluttering in her chest, and made her way inside. The hostess greeted her with a warm smile. "Miss Macris, right this way." Isla followed her through the restaurant, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The air was filled with the soft murmur of conversation and the clinking of wine glasses, but Isla barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed ahead, where the hostess led her to a private terrace overlooking the sea. Lucas was waiting there, dressed in a tailored navy suit that made him look like he'd just stepped out of a magazine. A single candle flickered on the table between them, casting a warm glow over his features. When he saw her, he stood, his expression softening as though the sight of her had stolen his breath. "You look." He paused, his lips curving into a smile. "Incredible," Isla blushed, smoothing her hands over the dress. "You didn't have to do all this, Lucas." "Yes, I did," he said simply. He stepped closer, taking her hand and pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. "Because you deserve it. Every bit of it." He pulled out her chair, and Isla sat, still trying to process the surrealness of the moment. As the waiter poured them each a glass of champagne, Lucas reached across the table to take her hand again. "I've been waiting for this night since the moment I left," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I've thought about you every single day, Isla. About this island, about your laugh, your stubbornness, the way you look at me like I'm not the man the world expects me to be." Her heart clenched, and she squeezed his hand gently. "Because you're not," she said softly. "You're so much more than that, Lucas. You've always seen me," he said, his gaze never wavering from hers. "And I want you to know that I see you too. I see how hard you've worked to keep this shop running, to honor your mother's memory. I see how much you've given to everyone around you, even when you didn't have much to give. And I want to be the one who gives back to you, Lucas." Isla's voice trembled, emotion thick in her throat. "You already have. Just by being here, by choosing me." He smiled, but there was an intensity in his eyes that told her he wasn't done yet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, setting it on the table between them. "I've thought about how to do this 100 different ways," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "But the truth is, there's only one thing that matters. Isla, I love you. I love you more than I ever thought I could love anyone. And I don't want to spend another day without you by my side." He opened the box to reveal a ring, simple yet elegant, with a single diamond that sparkled like the stars above them. Isla's breath caught, her hands flying to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. "Will you marry me?" Lucas asked, his voice filled with quiet certainty. For a moment, Isla couldn't speak. The world seemed to tilt around her, and all she could see was Lucas, the man who had turned her life upside down in the best way possible. "Yes," she finally whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes, I'll marry you." Lucas's smile was radiant as he slid the ring onto her finger and stood to pull her into his arms. The applause from the nearby tables barely registered as he kissed her, their love consuming everything else around them. The wedding was held 2 months later, a small but stunning ceremony on a cliff overlooking the sea. Isla wore a gown that Lucas had insisted on having custom made for her, and Lucas looked every bit the dashing groom in his tailored suit. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, each one a promise to love, support, and cherish the other for the rest of their lives. As they shared their first dance under a canopy of twinkling lights, Isla leaned into Lucas's embrace, her head resting against his chest. "Do you think your father is ever going to forgive me for stealing you away from his plans?" she teased softly. Lucas chuckled, his fingers brushing against her cheek. "He'll live. Besides, I didn't run away, I just ran toward something better." "And what's that?" she asked, tilting her head to look up at him. "You," he said simply, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You're my home now, Isla." As the music swelled around them, Isla smiled, knowing that, for the first time in her life, she truly had everything she'd ever wanted. And so did Lucas. Together, they had found something money could never buy: a love that was real, passionate, and theirs to keep forever.